For this week's retro review, I decided to take a look at the 1994 revenge movie / gothic romance The Crow starring Brandon Lee, and what was tragically his final performance since he was accidentally killed while making this movie. In this movie, Brandon Lee plays Eric Draven, a rocker who gets murdered along with his girlfriend on October 30th, aka Devil's Night. A year later, he's brought back from the dead by a mysterious crow, and it's not long after this until Eric realizes that the crow also imbued on him a set of powers. He can rapidly reheal, he's stronger, he's more agile, he can see through the eyes of this crow, and he understands that he can use these newly gotten powers in order to seek revenge against the thugs who did this to him and his girlfriend. So he gets ready and sets out on his one-man revenge quest, brutally working his way up the ranks until he reaches the leader of the criminal organization, Top Dollar, who's responsible for not only destroying his life, but the lives of many other people as well. Right off the bat, the setting of this movie is just dripping with a style and atmosphere. Even though it is just Detroit, they shot it in a way that makes the city feel like a character in and of itself, whether it's the dark alleys, the abandoned buildings, the empty streets, the constant rain. I'm not really going to dive too far into the analysis of this movie, but the fantastical nature of the city really does lend itself to the feeling that this takes place in a sort of purgatory, and it kind of goes with the story of the movie where Eric Draven has to make right certain things that happened to him in his life in order for him to be able to move on. And it's kind of supported by a line that he says at one point in the movie where a thug that he killed was in fact already dead.
You're the guy that murdered Tintin.
He was already dead. He died a year ago, the moment he touched her. They're all dead. They just don't know it yet.
Basically, I got to give a round of applause to the production design of this movie because they really knocked it out of the park. This is a 30-year-old film, and there's nothing about it that I find inherently dated other than maybe the style. And there's really nothing wrong with the style that they used for this movie. It's just that we don't really see too many movies these days made looking like this one does. I'm not saying the performances in this movie were necessarily Oscar caliber, but they really worked for what they were going for. Michael Wincott is naturally a fantastic villain whenever he takes on a villainous role, and here he did a great job as the leader of the thugs, Top Dollar. And then there's Ernie Hudson's character as the cop who initially found Eric and his girlfriend Shelley murdered, and he sort of brings a humanity to the movie that the rest of it is kind of missing. The overall standout performance of this movie, though, has to go to Brandon Lee because he definitely walks a fine line between the brutal vigilante going after the people who killed him and his girlfriend, but also the sad figure trying to mourn the loss of not only his life, but the life of the woman that he once loved. There's definitely shifts that you see throughout the movie with his character where at some points he comes across as just completely psychotic, but at other points he's more of a sad figure where you can really feel the tragedy of his situation.
Are you gonna vanish into thin air again?
I thought I'd use your front door.
You get the feeling throughout the movie that Eric is on the verge of losing his humanity in his quest for revenge, and it's people like Ernie Hudson's character or the character of Sarah, a young girl that him and his girlfriend Shelley used to know, that kind of bring him back to reality and maintain that human side to him. The movie isn't super heavy on action scenes, but there's enough decent ones sprinkled throughout the movie so you don't get bored, and they vary them up enough so that it keeps it entertaining, especially the big shootout in the third act of the movie still holds up even to today. One of my biggest criticisms with this movie, though, is we really don't see a whole lot between Eric and Shelley. The only time we actually see them together is through some flashbacks in the movie, but when the movie starts, Eric is already dead and Shelley is dying, and the only way we can understand their relationship is just reflected in how Eric behaves when thinking about her. And maybe some people will say that's enough. We can see that the situation is tragic. We can see that he loved her and they're about to get married. We don't need to actually see them together throughout the movie. It just kind of gets into things. And I'm definitely open to the argument to that, but I just feel like we could have used a little bit more of their relationship prior to the tragic events that followed. Another issue I have is they never really established what his powers are or how he comes to learn that he can do certain things. Like the regeneration made sense. He cuts his hand and he sees his hand reheal. Okay, so it's pretty clear that's one of his powers. But some of the more obscure ones, like when he makes the drugs come out of Sarah's mom's body, they never really explained why he could do that or how he knew he can do that. It was just sort of, they needed that for the plot, so he did it and that was it. Speaking of people knowing something just for the sake of the plot, I didn't like how the bad guys were able to figure out that the crow is the source of Eric's power, because the only way they made that connection is because when they saw Eric, they happened to see a crow too, so they drew the connection that the crow must be responsible for his powers, and I think that's a pretty big leap in logic, but it was clearly done because in the final showdown with the main bad guy and his core group, they needed to have Eric nerfed, because if he's just immortal, well then it's less exciting, so they needed to do something in order to tone down his powers for that final showdown. It just seemed like they handled it in kind of a lazy way for this movie.
You're bleeding all over the place. I thought, you were invincible.
I was. I'm not anymore.
And also, I'd kind of like to know why he paints his face the way that he does, because it's not like he came out of the grave looking that way for any particular reason. He just decided to paint his face to mimic a mask that he had at his apartment. Is there a significance to this mask? Maybe I might have missed it, granted, but still, it seemed like it was kind of weird. I was figuring at first maybe it's because he's a musician, so he paints his face like that for performances, but at one point in the movie, Sarah holds up a record that has Eric Draven and his band on it, and none of them have the face paint on, so it just seems like he's painting his face to mimic that mask for no apparent reason. Obviously, this is a bit of a nitpick on my part, but still, I kind of like to have explanations for why characters do certain things. Not everything, though. Like, I don't need to have an explanation of why he dresses the way he does, but going around wearing face paint, I kind of would have liked to have known why. This might seem like I'm being a bit negative about this movie, but that's really not my intention. These are just certain things that stood out to me that I thought about as I was watching it, but they're not taken away from anything. Overall, I really did enjoy this, and as a comic book movie, I wish more comic book movies would not necessarily look like this, but be more willing to actually take a chance and do something different, because unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that's been coming out, like from DC and Marvel in recent years, all seems to kind of just mesh together where you can't distinguish one from the other, but this movie right here has a unique style and feel to it that I think other comic book movies should take note of, not necessarily copying the style of The Crow, but trying to do their own thing instead of just trying to be what everyone else is doing. It is unfortunate, though, that talk surrounding this movie is often overshadowed by the tragic passing of Brandon Lee while making this movie, because there's a lot more that it offers than just the stories that went on behind the scenes. There's a cool style to it, an awesome soundtrack, great action scenes, and a memorable performance by Brandon Lee. And it really just goes to show, since he died at such a young age, like what could have been if his career was allowed to continue on. And that's why I'm giving this movie a 7 out of 10. But let me know what you think about all this in the comment section below. Do you like this movie? Have you actually seen it? Because if you haven't, I recommend you give it a shot, because it still holds up really well even to today, and it really just goes to show that a remake of this is completely unnecessary, but that's really just what I think. I'm curious what other people have to say, and if you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button if you want to see more of my reviews or stay up to date with the latest in entertainment news. And if you can, why don't you click that like button and share the video, because it really helps out with the channel. Thank you.